They called it a hospital, but what happened inside these walls was nothing close to healing. In the heart of Philadelphia stood a place built for the mentally ill, a place meant to bring peace to troubled minds. Instead, it became a living nightmare. Patients were stripped, beaten, and forgotten. Thousands crammed into filthy, dark wards where screams never stopped. For decades, no one outside knew what was happening here. The smell of rot, the cries for help, the silence of the staff. Everything about this place whispered one truth. This wasn't a hospital. It was a prison of pain, disguised as care. And when one man finally dared to step inside with a camera, he uncovered horrors that would shock the entire nation and change the way America looked at mental hospitals forever. This is the true story of Byberry State Hospital, where humanity was lost and nightmares were real. In the early 1900s, Philadelphia wanted to solve a growing problem: the rising number of people suffering from mental illness. The city promised compassion, care, and progress. So in 1907, construction began on what they proudly called the Philadelphia Hospital for Mental Diseases, a place that would later be known simply as Byberry State Hospital. From the outside, it looked peaceful. Red brick buildings surrounded by green fields, long hallways filled with sunlight. Officials spoke of moral treatment, of kindness, structure, and rehabilitation. It sounded like hope. But behind the speeches and polished headlines, there was something deeply wrong. Byberry was never built for comfort. It was built cheaply and quickly. Patients were crammed into overcrowded wards almost from the start. Doctors were underpaid, nurses were few, and training was almost non-existent. The idea of treating the mentally ill soon turned into containing them. By the 1920s, the cracks in the system were already visible. There were reports of neglect, of patients being tied down for hours, left in cold rooms, or locked away simply because they didn't fit into society. People were sent to Byberry not just for illness, but for being poor, unwanted, or different. The hospital's population grew fast. Designed for a few hundred, it soon held thousands. Wards meant for 30 patients now held 80. Beds lined the hallways, the smell of sweat and despair hanging in the air. Yet, city officials kept calling it a model institution. By the 1930s, that illusion began to fade. The more patients arrived, the less care anyone received. What began as a place of healing slowly transformed into something far darker. A warehouse for broken people, forgotten by the world outside. And as the years passed, the truth became impossible to hide. Whispers spread through the city. Visitors spoke of bruised bodies, of patients wandering naked, of screams echoing through the night. But still, no one intervened. Byberry was growing, not in hope or humanity, but in horror. And soon, it would become one of the most infamous hospitals in America's history. By the 1940s, Byberry was no longer a hospital. It was a human dumping ground. What had started as a place of care had become a prison of the forgotten. Overcrowding reached unbearable levels. The facility was built for about 2,500 patients, but inside, over 6,000 souls were trapped. Men and women packed together like cattle, stripped of dignity and identity. The air was thick with disease, the stench of sweat, waste, and decay, never leaving the halls. Beds were a luxury. Most patients slept on the cold, filthy floors, their bodies covered in sores and bruises. Rats scurried across the wards at night, feeding on leftover food, and sometimes on the patients themselves. Nurses were outnumbered and overworked. Some turned cruel. Others simply stopped caring. In Byberry, compassion was the first thing to die. The wards echoed with cries, not from insanity, but from agony. Patients were beaten, tied to beds, or locked in isolation rooms for days. Some were forced to stand naked for hours as punishment. Others were left in straitjackets until their arms went numb. The line between patient and prisoner vanished. Doctors experimented with outdated treatments, electric shocks, ice baths, and forced labor. And yet, the city called it therapy. Those who entered rarely left. Families stopped visiting. Records vanished. People who were supposed to be cared for simply disappeared into the system, erased by neglect and silence. But the most horrifying part was how normal it had become. Staff members walked past the abuse every day, numb to the screams and filth around them. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was an accepted reality. Byberry had become a world of its own, cut off from compassion, from oversight, from humanity, a dark machine that consumed the vulnerable and left only shells of the people they once were. Yet, in the middle of all this madness, someone was watching, a man who would walk through those doors not as a doctor, not as a guard, but as a witness, and what he saw inside would shock the world. For decades, the nightmare inside Byberry remained hidden from the outside world. Reports were buried, complaints ignored, and those who tried to speak up were silenced. But in 1946, that silence finally broke. A man named Charlie Lord, a former conscientious objector during World War II, had worked inside Byberry as part of a civilian service program. What he saw there haunted him. Naked patients lying on cold floors, covered in filth. Men and women huddled together in rooms so crowded you could barely walk between them. Bodies bruised, eyes empty, as if the soul had already left. Lord knew that words alone could never describe what he had witnessed. So, he did something no one had dared to do before. He took a camera inside, risking everything. He began to document the horror, secretly photographing the wards, the patients, and the inhuman conditions that had become normal inside Byberry. Every click of the shutter was an act of rebellion. Every photograph, a cry for justice. When his images were finally published, the world stopped. Life magazine printed them in a shocking exposé that stripped away decades of lies and denial. Americans saw, for the first time, what was really happening behind the locked doors of their mental institutions. The public reaction was immediate and furious. The images of naked, starving patients standing in their own waste couldn't be ignored. Politicians who had praised Byberry as a model hospital were suddenly silent. The truth was undeniable. This was not care. This was cruelty. Investigations began, and the hospital's administrators scrambled to defend themselves. They blamed overcrowding, lack of funding, and untrained staff. But no excuse could wash away the stain of what had been revealed. Charlie Lord's courage forced a nation to confront its own inhumanity. His photographs didn't just expose Byberry, they ignited a movement. Mental health reform swept across the United States, demanding that patients be treated with dignity, not as prisoners. But for the souls trapped inside Byberry, reform came too late. The photographs had shown the horror, but the pain they captured was real and irreversible. Byberry would never recover its reputation. The walls that once hid its secrets now stood as silent witnesses, proof that sometimes the worst monsters wear white coats. After Charlie Lord's photographs shocked the nation, the world finally looked toward Byberry, and what it saw could never be unseen. Inspections flooded in, journalists swarmed the grounds, and the hospital that once hid behind thick red brick walls was suddenly laid bare for all to judge. City officials promised change. They spoke of new funding, better staff, and modern reforms. But inside those wards, nothing changed overnight. The smell of rot, the cries of patients, the emptiness in their eyes, those things didn't vanish because of headlines. They lingered, like ghosts that refused to be forgotten. Through the 1950s and 1960s, small improvements were made. But they were never enough. Overcrowding continued, abuse persisted in the shadows. And even as America's mental health system began to modernize, Byberry remained a symbol of everything that could go wrong when compassion turned into control. By the 1970s, public outrage had long cooled, but the hospital's horror stories had not stopped. Former patients began to speak out, telling tales of beatings, starvation, and years lost inside a system that treated them as less than human. Lawsuits followed, investigations reopened, and each time the conclusion was the same: Byberry was beyond saving. In the 1980s, the final collapse began. The buildings decayed, the roof leaked, and rats ruled the halls. Staff came and went, some doing their best, others doing far worse. Those who visited described it as a place frozen in time, a rotting monument to decades of neglect. Finally, in June 1990, the gates of Byberry closed for good. Patients were moved to new facilities, the doors locked, the windows boarded. But even in death, the hospital refused to rest. Explorers, journalists, and thrill-seekers who entered its ruins spoke of the silence that hung heavy in the air. Rooms still filled with rusted beds, peeling paint, and patient files scattered like tombstones of forgotten lives. Some swore they could still hear faint whispers in the empty corridors, echoes of those who suffered and never left. Byberry was gone, but its story remained. A warning written in blood and dust, a reminder of what happens when the vulnerable are hidden away and forgotten. The walls may have crumbled, but the screams, the truth, will always remain.